On what should have been the happiest night of her life, a young bride named Sarah is betrayed when her new husband sells her to an Apache warrior in exchange for gold. The year is 1874, and the Arizona Territory is a harsh land where survival often requires choices that test the very essence of human decency. Sarah expects cruelty and captivity from the man who now claims her, but instead finds herself treated with dignity and kindness by a warrior who speaks in gentle tones and offers her respect she never received in her own world. As days turn to weeks, she learns his language and begins to understand his way of life. Mistrust slowly gives way to something neither expected. But how can a heart torn between two worlds ever find peace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell had grown up believing that a lady's greatest accomplishment was the ability to pour tea without trembling and recite poetry in French. Her mother's worn Bible, bound in cracked leather and edged in gold, that had long since faded, rested heavy in her traveling bag as the stagecoach lurched through another pothole on the dusty trail to Prescott. The book had been her mother's dying gift, pressed into Sarah's hands with whispered words about faith sustaining her through whatever trials lay ahead. Catherine Hartwell had been a woman of refinement who'd never imagined her daughter would one day flee Philadelphia society like a criminal escaping justice, but respectability was a luxury the Hartwell family could no longer afford. Her father's investments in railroad bonds had crumbled when the company went bankrupt, taking with it not only their fortune but their standing in Philadelphia's rigid social hierarchy. The shame had been unbearable, former friends crossing streets to avoid conversation, invitations that simply stopped arriving, creditors appearing at their front door with increasing frequency. Thomas Whitmore had appeared like salvation wrapped in a decent suit and bearing letters of introduction from mutual acquaintances. A businessman with mining interests in the Arizona Territory, he claimed to have made his fortune in silver and copper. More importantly, he needed a wife to help establish his respectability in frontier society, and he was willing to overlook the Hartwell family's recent financial difficulties. The arrangement had been concluded with the efficiency of a business transaction. Sarah's hand in marriage, in exchange for the settlement of her father's debts and a modest dowry that would allow her elderly father to live out his remaining years with dignity. She'd accepted because refusing meant watching her father face debtor's prison, and because at 22 she understood that damaged goods rarely received second offers. Thomas had been attentive during their brief courtship, bringing flowers and speaking of the opportunities that awaited them in the growing territories. He painted pictures of grand houses they would build, of the respect they would command in a society hungry for civilization and refinement. Sarah had allowed herself to believe in his vision, perhaps because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. The journey west had taken 3 weeks of cramped stagecoaches, questionable meals at way stations, and nights spent in accommodations that would have horrified her former companions. Each mile had stripped away another layer of the life she'd known, until she felt as raw and exposed as the landscape that stretched endlessly beyond the coach windows. Thomas had grown quieter as they traveled, drinking more heavily at each stop and losing money in poker games with fellow travelers. The charming suitor who'd courted her in Philadelphia seemed to be disappearing, replaced by a man who grew increasingly agitated as they neared their destination. When she'd expressed concern about his gambling, he'd snapped at her with a viciousness that left her stunned and fearful. "You'll learn quickly enough that out here, a man does what he must to survive," he'd said, his words slurred by whiskey. "Your delicate sensibilities won't last long in Arizona, my dear. Best you start toughening up now." The Prescott they finally reached bore little resemblance to the thriving community Thomas had described. Dusty streets lined with rough-hewn buildings, saloons that never seemed to close, and an air of desperation that hung over everything like smoke. The women she glimpsed looked worn down by the harsh life, their faces aged beyond their years by wind and sun and hardship. Their wedding had been arranged for the day after their arrival, in a small church that smelled of sawdust and unfulfilled prayers. The preacher was a thin man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely pleased to perform a ceremony that didn't involve a shotgun or a rushed burial. Sarah had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered hastily by a local seamstress who clucked sympathetically over the fine fabric and delicate lacework. Standing at that makeshift altar, clutching her mother's Bible and trying to ignore Thomas's whiskey-scented breath, Sarah had promised to love, honor and obey a man she was beginning to suspect she didn't know at all. The ring he'd placed on her finger was too large, sliding loosely around her slender finger like a shackle that didn't quite fit. The few townsfolk who attended the ceremony offered polite congratulations, but she caught the way their eyes lingered on Thomas with something that might have been pity or warning. Later, she would remember those glances and wonder if they had known what was coming, if they had seen the signs that her sheltered upbringing had left her blind to recognize. The faded daguerreotype of her mother had traveled in Sarah's reticule through every mile of their westward journey, a small reminder of grace and wisdom in an increasingly graceless world. Catherine Hartwell's serene face gazed out from the silver-plated image, captured in better times, when the family's future had seemed secure, and Sarah's biggest concern was choosing the right gloves for Sunday service. During the long hours of travel, Sarah found herself studying that beloved face and hearing her mother's voice as clearly as if she sat beside her in the swaying coach. A lady's true strength, Catherine had often said, lies not in her ability to avoid hardship, but in how she conducts herself when trials come calling. At the time, Sarah had assumed her mother spoke of minor social embarrassments or perhaps the loss of a favorite brooch. She had never imagined trials that would strip away everything familiar and safe. Thomas's transformation during their journey had been gradual but unmistakable. The courteous gentleman who had charmed her in Philadelphia society grew increasingly morose and distracted as they traveled west. He spent his evenings in saloons at every stop, returning to their modest lodgings with the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath and his temper frayed thin as worn cloth. "This damned territory will be the death of civilized men," he muttered one evening as they prepared to retire in yet another rough way station. "Nothing but heat and dust and savages waiting to scalp decent folk. Sometimes I wonder what madness possessed me to think I could make a life out here." Sarah had tried to comfort him, suggesting that perhaps their arrival in Prescott would lift his spirits, that establishing their own household would restore his optimism. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears, and she noticed how his hands shook slightly when he thought she wasn't watching, how his eyes held a desperate quality that reminded her uncomfortably of her father during the worst days of their financial collapse. The town of Prescott, when they finally reached it, proved even more disappointing than Thomas's darkening mood had prepared her for. The main street was little more than a wide dirt track, lined with buildings that looked as if they'd been thrown together by men in a hurry to get somewhere else. The hotel where they took their wedding night room was a two-story structure that swayed ominously in the desert wind, its walls so thin that every conversation from neighboring rooms carried clearly through the rough-hewn planks. The local citizens they encountered were a mix of prospectors, merchants and drifters, all bearing the weathered look of people who'd learned to expect little from life and were rarely disappointed. The women she glimpsed seemed older than their years, their faces lined by sun and hardship, their manner cautious in a way that spoke of lessons learned through bitter experience. At the general store where they purchased supplies for their modest household, Sarah overheard two women discussing the recent Apache raids that had driven several families back east. "It's getting so a body can't feel safe more than a stone's throw from town," one whispered to the other. "My husband's talking about giving up the claim and heading back to Kansas before we end up like the Morrison family." The mention of Apache sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. In Philadelphia, Indians had been the stuff of dime novels and wild tales told by traveling lecturers. Here, they were a real and present danger that could appear without warning from the surrounding mountains and canyons. Thomas had mentioned them only briefly during their courtship, dismissing her concerns with assurances that the army kept the hostiles well in hand. But the tension she felt in Prescott's streets told a different story. Men kept rifles close at hand, women hurried through their errands without lingering to chat, and even the children seemed subdued, as if they'd learned early that loud voices might attract unwanted attention from the wilderness beyond the town's fragile borders. Their wedding ceremony, hastily arranged for the morning after their arrival, took place in a small adobe church that still smelled of fresh mortar and hope. The preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Walsh, spoke movingly about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of two souls joining together to face whatever challenges the frontier might present. But even as Sarah spoke her vows, clutching her mother's daguerreotype in one hand and accepting Thomas's ring with the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more dangerous than a simple marriage. Thomas's hand trembled as he placed the ring on her finger, and she caught him glancing repeatedly toward the saloon across the street, as if something there called to him more strongly than the sacred words being spoken over their union. The ivory hair combs had been Thomas's wedding gift to her, presented with a flourish that morning as she prepared for their ceremony. "Every bride deserves something beautiful on her wedding day," he'd said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The combs were delicately carved with tiny roses and leaves, probably expensive ones, though Sarah suspected they'd been purchased from some desperate soul at one of the many pawn shops that lined Prescott's main street. She'd worn them in her hair during the ceremony, their smooth surface cool against her scalp, as Reverend Walsh spoke the words that would bind her fate to Thomas's. Now, hours later, she sat before the cracked mirror in their hotel room, carefully removing the combs and wondering if this would be the last time she'd feel beautiful, the last time such delicate things would have a place in her life. The wedding breakfast had been a modest affair at the hotel's dining room, attended by a handful of townspeople who seemed more curious than celebratory. Mrs. Patterson, the hotel proprietor's wife, had made an effort with wildflowers and a cake that tasted strongly of alkali water. But the forced cheer couldn't disguise the underlying tension that seemed to permeate everything in this harsh place. Thomas had grown increasingly agitated as the day wore on, checking his pocket watch with nervous frequency and casting longing glances toward the Silver Dollar Saloon across the street. When one of the local merchants invited him to join a friendly card game to celebrate his nuptials, Sarah had seen something desperate flash across her new husband's face. "Just a quick game," he'd assured her, kissing her cheek with lips that tasted of whiskey despite the early hour. "A man should celebrate his wedding properly, and I've been feeling lucky today." That had been 6 hours ago. Through their thin hotel room walls, Sarah could hear the sounds from the saloon, growing louder and more raucous as the evening progressed. Occasionally, she caught snatches of angry voices, the sound of furniture scraping across wooden floors, and once, what might have been Thomas's voice raised in what sounded like pleading. She'd tried to occupy herself with arranging their meager possessions in the small room, hanging her few dresses in the narrow wardrobe, and setting her mother's Bible on the rickety table beside the bed. But each passing hour brought fresh anxiety about what was keeping her husband away, on what should have been their wedding night. The other women she'd met in town had treated her with a mixture of sympathy and knowing looks that left her uncomfortable. When she'd mentioned Thomas's business interests in mining, she'd caught more than one exchange of meaningful glances, though no one had been bold enough to voice whatever thoughts those looks conveyed. Mrs. Patterson had been particularly kind, bringing Sarah tea and making gentle conversation about the challenges of frontier life. "It takes a special kind of strength to make a go of it out here," the older woman had said, her weathered hands gentle as she arranged wildflowers in a mason jar. "The desert has a way of showing folks who they really are, underneath all the fancy manners and pretty words." As darkness settled over Prescott, Sarah found herself standing at the room's single window, watching the lamplit windows of the saloon and trying to make sense of the sick feeling that had been growing in her stomach since Thomas had left that morning. The ivory combs caught the lamplight as she turned them over in her hands, their delicate beauty seeming almost obscene in this rough place where survival mattered more than aesthetics. A commotion from the street below drew her attention, and she pressed her face to the glass to see a small group of men on horseback riding slowly down the main street. Even in the dim light, she could tell these weren't townspeople. They sat their horses with a fluid grace that spoke of lives spent in the saddle, and something about their bearing made her breath catch in her throat. Apache. The word formed in her mind with cold certainty, though she'd never seen an Indian before tonight. They moved with quiet confidence through the town, and she noticed how quickly the few people still on the street melted into doorways and shadows. These weren't the savage raiders of dime novel stories, but there was something undeniably dangerous about them, a sense of barely contained power that made her step back from the window. The sound of heavy footsteps on the hotel stairs broke her trance, and she heard Thomas's voice in the hallway, thick with drink, and raised in what sounded like argument with another man. When the door burst open, Thomas stumbled into the room, his wedding clothes disheveled, and his face bearing the desperate look of a man who'd lost everything he'd ever owned. Behind him stood a tall Apache warrior, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the small room before settling on Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. In his hand he held a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. The bag of gold coins hit the rickety table with a dull thud that seemed to echo through Sarah's chest like a death knell. In the lamplight, the leather pouch looked innocuous enough, but the weight of it, the way Thomas's eyes fixed upon it with desperate hunger, told her that her life had just taken a turn into territory more foreign than anything she'd encountered on their westward journey. 30 pieces, Thomas said, his voice slurred but carrying an edge of hysteria. Enough to cover my debts and get me passage back east, back to civilization where a man can make an honest living. He wouldn't meet her eyes as he spoke, instead staring at the coins as if they might disappear if he looked away. The Apache warrior stood silent in the doorway, his presence filling the small room despite his stillness. Sarah had never been this close to an Indian before, and everything she'd heard in Philadelphia drawing rooms had prepared her to see a savage, a painted demon from frontier nightmares. Instead, she found herself looking at a man perhaps 30 years of age, tall and lean, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "What is this? What's happening?" Her husband finally looked at her then, and the guilt in his face told her everything she didn't want to know. "I lost everything, Sarah. The mine, the claims, every dollar I brought west. These gentlemen at the card table, they were very understanding about extending credit, but patience has its limits." The word gentleman carried bitter irony, and Sarah understood that Thomas had fallen into debt with men who collected what was owed through methods that didn't involve courts or lawyers. The kind of men who would accept alternative forms of payment when cash wasn't available. "You can't mean to," she began, but her words died as Thomas began stuffing his few belongings into his traveling bag with shaking hands. "Ina here has been most reasonable," Thomas continued, gesturing toward the Apache warrior as if discussing a business transaction for livestock. "He needs a woman to keep his household, and I need to settle my obligations. It's a fair trade, and you'll be safer with him than you would be if I leave you here to face my creditors alone." The Apache man, Ina, spoke for the first time, his English careful but clear. "Your husband owes much money to dangerous men. They would sell you to traders who take women south, across the border. Such women are not seen again." Sarah felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet as the full horror of her situation became clear. Thomas hadn't just gambled away their future, he'd gambled away her very life, and now stood ready to hand her over to a stranger, as if she were a piece of property to be bartered. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure whether she was pleading with Thomas or with the tall Apache, who watched their exchange with impassive dignity. "There must be another way. We could return east together, start over. My father would help us." Thomas laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the small room. "Your father? The man who sold you to me to pay his own debts. What help could he possibly offer now?" The cruelty in his words was like a physical blow, stripping away the last of her illusions about the man she'd married that morning. Ina stepped forward, his movement fluid and silent. "I give you my word that no harm will come to you," he said, addressing Sarah directly for the first time. "You will be treated with respect and protected from those who would do you evil. Protected." Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. "By taking me away from everything I know, everyone I love." "There is no one here who loves you," Ina replied, his words gentle but implacable. "This man who calls himself your husband sells you like a horse or a cow. Is this how love shows itself in your world?" The truth of his observation cut deeper than any knife could have. Thomas was already moving toward the door, his bag in one hand and his eyes fixed on some imagined future that apparently didn't include her. In all his talk of escape and salvation, he hadn't once suggested that she might come with him, hadn't even pretended that their marriage vows meant anything more than convenient words spoken to satisfy social convention. "I'll send for you when I'm established again," Thomas said, the lie obvious even to him. "Once I've rebuilt my fortune, we can be together properly." but he was already walking out the door as he spoke, leaving behind only the lingering smell of whiskey and fear. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, still wearing her wedding dress, still carrying the ivory combs in her trembling hands, while her husband disappeared into the night like smoke. Ayana remained in the doorway, patient as stone, waiting for her to understand that her old life had ended, as surely as if she'd died. The bag of coins sat on the table between them, 30 pieces of silver that had bought and sold her soul to a stranger whose language she didn't speak, whose ways she didn't understand, whose very existence represented everything her sheltered upbringing had taught her to fear. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk adorned with her grandmother's pearl buttons, now bore the stains of tears and dust as Sarah sat rigidly in the saddle of Ayana's horse. The fabric had torn at the hem during her stumbling exit from the hotel, and she could feel more rips forming as the desert thorns caught at the delicate material with each mile they traveled away from Prescott. The dress had been her mother's, carefully preserved in tissue paper and lavender sachets, altered with loving hands for Sarah's special day. Now it felt like a mockery, a beautiful shell wrapped around the emptiness where her life used to be. With each passing hour, the silk grew more bedraggled, the pearls more tarnished, until she resembled nothing so much as a discarded doll left too long in the weather. Ayana rode beside her on his own mount, close enough to catch her if she swayed in the saddle, far enough away to avoid crowding her. He'd said nothing since they'd left the lights of Prescott behind, but Sarah was acutely aware of his presence, of the easy way he sat his horse, of how his dark eyes periodically checked on her welfare without seeming to stare. She had expected brutality, chains perhaps, or rough handling that would leave bruises to mark her captivity. Instead, Ayana had waited patiently while she gathered her few belongings, had helped her mount his spare horse with the same courtesy he might show a respected guest, and had set a pace that accommodated her inexperience in the saddle rather than his own desire for speed. The silence between them stretched like the desert landscape itself, vast and intimidating. Sarah's mind reeled with questions she lacked the courage to voice. Where was he taking her? What did he intend to do with her? Would she ever see another white face, hear another English word spoken with kindness? The stories she'd heard about Indian captives rushed through her memory unbidden. Tales of women driven mad by isolation, of tortures too terrible to speak aloud, of fates that made death seem like mercy. But the man riding beside her bore no resemblance to the savages of those lurid accounts. His clothing was well-made leather and cloth, his horse well cared for and responsive to the slightest touch of his hands. His weapons were clean and functional, rather than ceremonial, and his manner suggested a man accustomed to responsibility rather than random violence. As the night wore on and they climbed into the foothills beyond Prescott, Sarah found herself studying Ayana when she thought he wasn't aware of her attention. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of a life lived outdoors, but there was intelligence in his features, a thoughtfulness that challenged every assumption her upbringing had instilled about his people. When her horse stumbled on loose rock, Ayana was instantly alert, his hand moving to steady her mount before she was even fully aware of the danger. "Careful," he said quietly, the first word he'd spoken since they'd left town. "The trail is uncertain in darkness." His English was heavily accented but clear, suggesting education or at least extensive contact with white settlers. This too surprised her. She'd been raised to believe that Indians were primitive, incapable of learning civilized languages or concepts. Yet here was evidence that contradicted those teachings, as surely as his gentle treatment contradicted the stories of savage brutality. They stopped near midnight beside a small spring that bubbled up from between granite boulders. Ayana dismounted first, then moved to help Sarah down from her horse. She flinched as his hands touched her waist, expecting roughness or inappropriate familiarity, but his grip was impersonal and careful, steadying her until she found her footing on the uneven ground. "You must drink," he said, gesturing toward the spring. "The desert takes water from the body quickly." Sarah's throat was indeed parched, though she hadn't been aware of it until he mentioned it. She knelt beside the water and cupped it in her hands, surprised by its sweet clarity. In Philadelphia, she'd drunk from crystal glasses filled by uniformed servants. Here, kneeling on rough stone with her ruined wedding dress spread around her like a tattered banner, she found the simple water more satisfying than the finest wine she'd ever tasted. Ayana unsaddled the horses and hobbled them where they could graze on the sparse grass near the spring. His movements were economical and practiced, the actions of a man who'd made countless such camps. He built a small fire with wood gathered from dead scrub, the flames providing warmth against the desert's surprising chill. "You will sleep," he told her, producing a woven blanket from his pack. "Tomorrow we reach my people. Tonight you are safe." The blanket was softer than she'd expected, woven in patterns of red and black that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. As she wrapped it around her shoulders, she caught a faint scent of sage and something else, something that spoke of wind and open spaces and freedom. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the word torn from her before she could stop it. Why did you buy me?" Ayana looked at her across the small fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. For a long moment he said nothing, and Sarah thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. "There are wolves among your people, just as there are among mine. Sometimes the only way to save the lamb is to take it from the wolf's territory." The Apache blanket that had sheltered Sarah through the night carried the scent of wood smoke and sage when she woke to unfamiliar sounds echoing off canyon walls. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing, women were calling to one another in a musical language she didn't understand, and horses were nickering softly as they were led to water. The peaceful domestic sounds were so far from what she'd expected that for a moment she wondered if she might still be dreaming. Ayana's camp lay hidden in a narrow canyon, whose red stone walls rose like cathedral spires toward a ribbon of blue sky. A stream wound through the canyon floor, lined with cottonwoods that provided blessed shade from the desert sun. The location was defensible, concealed and beautiful in a way that took Sarah's breath away, despite her circumstances. But it was the people who truly challenged everything she thought she knew about Apache life. Instead of the primitive savages described in Philadelphia newspapers, she saw a community that functioned with obvious organization and purpose. Children played games that required strategy and skill, women worked at tasks that demanded both artistry and practical knowledge, and men discussed matters with the serious attention of any town council she'd ever observed. Sarah sat wrapped in Ayana's blanket, watching this foreign world with the fascination of a naturalist observing an entirely new species. The women wore clothing that was both practical and beautiful, decorated with beadwork and embroidery that spoke of patient hours and considerable skill. Their hair was arranged in complex styles that would have impressed the finest Philadelphia hairdressers, and they moved with a confidence that suggested they were valued members of their community rather than mere property. An elderly woman approached, her weathered face kind despite the curiosity in her dark eyes. She spoke to Ayana in rapid Apache, gesturing towards Sarah with movements that seemed more concerned than hostile. Sarah caught the sound of her own name in the flowing syllables, though she couldn't understand anything else being discussed. Ayana responded in the same language, his tone respectful in a way that suggested the old woman held considerable authority in the community. Sarah noticed how he listened to her words carefully, nodding at points as if receiving wisdom rather than simply making conversation. When their discussion ended, the woman approached Sarah with a pottery bowl filled with what appeared to be some kind of stew. The aroma was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, and Sarah's empty stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since her wedding breakfast the previous morning. "Grandmother Chenoa wishes you to eat," Ayana translated. "She says you are too thin, that the journey has been hard for you." Sarah accepted the bowl with trembling hands, surprised by the woman's kindness. In all her imaginings about Indian captivity, she'd never considered the possibility of being fed by a concerned grandmother who clucked over her welfare like a mother hen. The stew was surprisingly good, flavored with herbs she couldn't identify, but seasoned with obvious care. As she ate, more women gathered around her, chattering among themselves in voices that sounded curious rather than threatening. They examined her ruined wedding dress with obvious interest, fingering the silk fabric and exclaiming over the pearl buttons with the appreciation of people who understood fine craftsmanship. One younger woman, probably close to Sarah's own age, brought a wooden comb and gestured towards Sarah's tangled hair. The offer was made with shy smiles and gentle movements that transcended language barriers. When Sarah nodded her acceptance, the woman began working through the knots with patient care, her touch so gentle that Sarah found herself relaxing despite her circumstances. Children crept closer as the women worked, their dark eyes wide with curiosity about this strange, pale visitor. They whispered among themselves and giggled at responses Sarah couldn't understand, but their interest seemed more akin to wonder than fear. One bold little girl reached out to touch Sarah's hair, marveling at its texture and color, before scampering back to her friends with excited chatter. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself drawn into the rhythm of camp life, despite the language barrier. The women included her in their circle through gestures and smiles, showing her how they prepared food, worked leather, and tended to the endless tasks that kept their community functioning. Their methods were different from anything she'd learned in Philadelphia society, but their efficiency and skill were undeniable. Ayuna watched these interactions from a respectful distance, and Sarah noticed how the other men in the camp deferred to him in matters that seemed to concern her welfare. He was clearly a person of some importance here, though his authority seemed to come from respect rather than fear. When the sun reached its zenith and the canyon walls provided welcome shade, Ayuna approached with a cup of cool water and a place for her to rest away from the curious eyes of the children. "My people are not what you expected," he observed, settling beside her on a woven mat. Sarah considered her words carefully before responding. "No," she admitted, "they are not." The wooden cup that Ayuna carved for her during their third evening together was a simple thing, fashioned from pine and polished smooth by patient hands. But as Sarah held it, feeling the careful attention to detail in every curve and surface, she understood that this small gift represented something far more significant than mere practicality. It was the first thing anyone had made specifically for her comfort since her mother's death, the first gesture that suggested she might be seen as a person rather than a burden or a piece of property. Sarah had been watching Ayuna work on the cup for 2 days, stealing glances as he sat by the fire in the evening, his long fingers shaping the wood with tools that seemed almost delicate in his large hands. She'd assumed he was making it for someone else, perhaps one of the children who often gathered around him to hear stories or receive instruction in various skills. When he presented it to her with formal courtesy, saying simply, "For you, so that you need not share with others," she felt something shift inside her chest, some small wall beginning to crack. The gesture was kind without being intimate, practical without being dismissive, and it spoke of a consideration for her needs that she'd never received from Thomas, even during their brief courtship. The days in the Apache camp had settled into a rhythm that was both foreign and oddly comforting. Sarah woke each morning to the sound of the stream and the gentle voices of women beginning their daily tasks. Grandmother Chenoa had taken particular interest in her welfare, bringing her food and beginning to teach her Apache words through patient repetition and gentle correction. "Water," the old woman would say, pointing to the stream. "Chew." She would wait for Sarah to repeat the word, nodding encouragingly when the pronunciation was close enough to be understood. "Chew," Sarah would echo, and slowly, word by word, she began to build a vocabulary that allowed her to participate more fully in the life around her. The children delighted in teaching her new words, giggling when she mispronounced them and cheering when she got them right. Ayana himself proved to be an unexpectedly thoughtful teacher. In the evenings, when the camp settled into quiet conversation around small fires, he would sit near her and speak of his people's ways, translating conversations and explaining customs that might otherwise have remained mysterious. "Among my people," he told her one evening as they watched children playing a complex game with stones and sticks, "children are treasured not because they belong to their parents, but because they belong to the future. Each child who grows strong and wise makes the whole people stronger." Sarah found herself comparing this philosophy to her own upbringing, where children were seen primarily as extensions of their parents' social standing, valued for their ability to make advantageous marriages or enhance family prestige. The Apache approach seemed both more practical and more loving, focused on the child's development rather than their utility. As she learned more words and began to understand fragments of conversations, Sarah discovered that Ayana held a position of considerable respect in the community. The other men sought his counsel on matters ranging from hunting strategies to disputes between families. The women brought him their concerns about the children's education and the camp's security. Even the elders listened carefully when he spoke, weighing his words with obvious consideration. "You are a leader among your people," she observed one evening as they walked along the stream while the camp prepared for sleep. Ayana was quiet for a moment before responding. "Leadership is not about commanding others, it is about serving them, about making decisions that benefit the whole rather than the self. A leader who thinks only of his own desires will soon find himself leading no one." The implicit criticism of Thomas's behavior was gentle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she considered how completely her husband had embodied the selfish leadership Ayana described. Thomas had thought only of his own escape from debt, his own comfort, his own future, without any consideration for the woman whose life he'd destroyed in the process. "In my world," she said carefully, "men often become leaders through wealth or family connections rather than wisdom or service. And how well does that serve your people?" Ayana asked. Sarah thought of the corruption she'd witnessed in Philadelphia politics, the way wealth could buy influence, and influence could buy favorable treatment from judges and lawmakers. She thought of her father's financial ruin, caused partly by trusting men whose only qualification for handling investments was their social standing rather than their competence. "Not well," she admitted, "not well at all." That night, as she lay wrapped in her blanket listening to the peaceful sounds of the sleeping camp, Sarah held her wooden cup and considered how drastically her understanding of civilization had changed in just a few days. The hand-carved wooden comb that Ayana presented to her after a week in the camp was far more elaborate than the simple cup he'd made earlier. Delicate flowers and vines wound around its handle, and the teeth were spaced perfectly for working through her fine hair without causing pain. Sarah held it in the firelight, marveling at the hours of careful work it represented, and felt something warm and unfamiliar stir in her chest. "You made this for me?" she asked, though the answer was obvious from the way he watched her examine it, the quiet satisfaction in his dark eyes. "Your hair is beautiful," he said simply. "It should not suffer because you lack the proper tools to care for it." The compliment, delivered without pretense or expectation, made Sarah's cheeks warm. Thomas had never commented on her appearance, except to criticize some aspect of her dress or demeanor that might reflect poorly on his social standing. This simple acknowledgement of her beauty, offered with no apparent agenda beyond kindness, left her momentarily speechless. Their conversations had grown longer and more complex as Sarah's vocabulary improved. Ayana seemed to take genuine pleasure in teaching her, patiently correcting her pronunciation and encouraging her efforts even when she struggled with concepts that had no direct translation between their worlds. "In your language," she'd asked him the day before, "how do you say freedom?" He'd been quiet for a long moment, considering. "We have no word that means exactly what yours does. We say il-kidi, to walk your own path. But this assumes that all paths are connected, that one person's journey affects the whole community." Sarah had puzzled over this, thinking of how her own people spoke of freedom as the right to do as one pleased without consideration for others. The Apache concept seemed both more limiting and more expansive, acknowledging individual choice while recognizing responsibility to the community. "What does your word freedom mean to you?" Ayana had asked. Sarah had started to give the standard answer about liberty and self-determination, but found herself stopping. What had her freedom meant in Philadelphia? The freedom to pour tea correctly and speak French, and marry whoever her father chose for her financial convenience. The freedom to be decorative and obedient and silent about her own desires. "I think," she'd said slowly, "that I never understood what freedom meant until I lost it, or thought I had lost it." Now, as she ran the beautiful comb through her hair, Sarah reflected on how strange it was that captivity had brought her more genuine choice than she'd ever known in civilized society. Here she was learning skills that were actually useful, contributing to work that mattered, being valued for her growing abilities rather than her potential to enhance someone else's status. The women had begun including her more fully in their daily tasks. She'd learned to prepare traditional foods, to work with leather and beads, to help with the endless maintenance that kept the camp functioning. Her hands, once soft and useless except for ornamental purposes, were developing calluses and strength. Her back no longer ached from the unaccustomed physical labor. More importantly, she'd begun to understand the subtle social structures that governed Apache life. She watched how decisions were made through consensus rather than decree, how conflicts were resolved through discussion and compromise rather than force, how resources were shared according to need rather than accumulated for individual advantage. "Your people are wiser than mine," she told Ayana one evening as they sat by the stream, listening to the night sounds of the desert. "We have had to be," he replied. "When survival depends on cooperation, wisdom becomes more valuable than wealth." Sarah thought of the waste she'd witnessed in Philadelphia society, the enormous amounts of food and resources consumed by the wealthy while the poor went without. Here, nothing was wasted. Every scrap of leather, every bone from hunted game, every useful material was carefully preserved and put to good use. "Do you miss your old life?" Ayana asked gently. Sarah considered the question seriously. Did she miss the beautiful dresses that required servants to help her dress? The elaborate meals that she'd eaten without ever considering their cost or preparation? The social calls and tea parties that filled her days with meaningless chatter about people she didn't particularly like? "I miss my mother," she said finally, "and I miss feeling safe about the future, but the life itself, the days filled with nothing important, no, I don't think I miss that at all." "What did bring you happiness in that life?" "Reading," Sarah said immediately. "Learning new things. Sometimes I would sneak books from my father's library, books that ladies weren't supposed to read. History and science and philosophy. I wanted to understand how the world worked, not just how to ornament it properly." Ayana smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Here, understanding how the world works is not forbidden to women. Knowledge belongs to whoever can use it wisely." The medicine pouch that hung from Ayana's belt contained herbs and remedies that Sarah had never imagined could exist. When the desert fever struck her in the second week of her stay, leaving her weak and delirious with heat that seemed to burn from within, she expected to die far from home, with no one to mourn her passing. Instead, she found herself receiving care that was both more skilled and more tender than anything she'd experienced from Philadelphia's finest physicians. The illness had come suddenly, as desert sickness often did. One morning she'd felt perfectly well, helping grandmother Chenoa prepare corn for grinding. By afternoon she was shivering despite the blazing sun, and by evening her fever was so high that she barely recognized the concerned faces gathered around her bedding. Ayana had knelt beside her, his large hand cool against her burning forehead, and she'd seen something in his dark eyes that looked very much like fear. "The desert tests all who come to live here," he'd told her quietly. "But you are strong. You will survive this." For 3 days he'd tended her with a devotion that surprised everyone in the camp, including Sarah herself. He'd prepared teas from plants whose names she couldn't pronounce, medicines that tasted bitter but seemed to draw the fire from her blood. He'd bathed her face with cool water when the fever peaked, and covered her with extra blankets when the chills took hold. Most remarkably, he'd talked to her through the worst of it, his voice low and steady, telling her stories of his people and his land, keeping her anchored to consciousness when the fever threatened to carry her away entirely. She'd learned things in her delirium that she might never have heard in health, intimate details about his childhood, his training as a warrior, the losses that had shaped him into the man he'd become. "My wife was called Morning Star," he'd told her during one long night when sleep seemed impossible. "She died of the spotted sickness that your people brought to our lands. Our children died with her. For 3 years after, I thought the sun would never bring me joy again." The grief in his voice had penetrated even her fever-clouded mind, and she'd understood then why he'd sometimes seemed so distant, why his kindness carried an edge of careful protection. He'd loved deeply and lost everything, and now he was caring for another white woman who might also be taken from him by forces beyond his control. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "It is the way of things," he'd replied. "We love, we lose, we learn to love again. The alternative is to become stone, and stones cannot protect anything that matters." As her fever broke and strength slowly returned, Sarah found herself seeing Ayana with new eyes. The attention he'd paid to her care went far beyond duty or even kindness. There had been genuine fear in his face when she was at her worst, genuine relief when the crisis passed. He'd tended her as a man tends someone precious to him, and the realization both warmed and frightened her. "Why?" she asked him on the morning she was finally able to sit up without assistance. "Why did you care for me so carefully?" I'm nothing to you, a stranger thrust into your life by circumstances neither of us chose. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, considering his words with the care he brought to all important matters. When I first saw you in that room with your husband, you looked like Morning Star did when the soldiers brought her to me, broken and afraid but not defeated. I thought perhaps the spirits had sent you to me for reasons I did not yet understand. And now I think perhaps they sent me to you. The medicine pouch that had provided her healing remedies also contained other items, she learned as her recovery progressed. Small stones from places that held spiritual significance, bits of wood from trees struck by lightning, fragments of pottery from ancestors long dead. It was a collection of power and memory, carried close to the heart by a man who understood that healing involved more than just the body. Your medicine is more effective than anything our doctors know, Sarah told him as she felt her strength fully returning. Your doctors treat sickness as an enemy to be defeated, Ayana replied. We treat it as a message to be understood. The body speaks to us of imbalances that must be corrected, of spirits that must be appeased, of harmony that must be restored. Sarah thought of the harsh treatments she'd received in Philadelphia for minor ailments, the bleeding and purging that seemed designed to punish the body rather than heal it. Compared to the gentle effectiveness of Apache medicine, her own people's methods seemed both primitive and cruel. Will you teach me, she asked, about your medicines, your healing ways? If you wish to learn, Ayana said, and she heard approval in his voice. Knowledge shared is knowledge strengthened. The beaded headband that the Apache women presented to Sarah was more than decoration. It was a symbol of acceptance that marked her transition from outsider to member of the community. The intricate pattern of blue and white beads formed symbols she was only beginning to understand, but Grandmother Chenoa had explained that they represented protection, wisdom, and new beginnings. You are no longer the frightened bird who came to us, the old woman had said through Ayana's translation as she placed the headband on Sarah's hair. You are becoming one of us, learning our ways, contributing to our strength. The ceremony had been simple but moving, conducted with the same quiet dignity that characterized all Apache rituals Sarah had witnessed. The women had gathered in the evening light, sharing stories and laughter as they worked on their various crafts. When Grandmother Chenoa had produced the headband and called Sarah forward, she'd felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected honor. Sarah's integration into the camp's daily life had accelerated dramatically since her recovery from the desert fever. No longer content to be a passive observer, she'd thrown herself into learning every skill the women were willing to teach. Her hands, once soft and useless for anything but ornamental purposes, now bore the calluses and small scars that came from useful work. She'd learned to tan hides with a mixture of brain and liver that would have horrified her Philadelphia sensibilities, but produced leather softer than anything she'd ever owned. She could start a fire with flint and steel, prepare corn in a dozen different ways, and identify the plants that provided medicine, food, and materials for weaving. More importantly, she'd learned to see herself as part of something larger than her individual concerns. In Philadelphia society, her value had been measured by her ability to reflect well on her family's status and eventually her husband's position. Here she was valued for her growing ability to contribute to the community's welfare and survival. The Apache women had accepted her with a generosity that still amazed her. They'd been patient with her fumbling attempts at their language, encouraging her efforts even when she made mistakes that sent the children into fits of giggles. They'd shared their knowledge freely, teaching her not just practical skills, but the stories and traditions that gave meaning to daily tasks. In my world, Sarah told Ayana one evening as they walked along the stream, women are taught that we must compete with each other for men's attention and approval. Here your women seem to work together to support each other. Competition has its place, Ayana replied thoughtfully, but not in matters of survival. When the desert is your enemy, you cannot afford to make enemies of your own people. Sarah thought of the elaborate social games she'd witnessed in Philadelphia drawing rooms, the way women undermined each other with careful words and calculated slights. The energy wasted on such petty conflicts could have accomplished so much if directed toward useful purposes. Her relationship with Ayana had deepened during her illness and recovery, though neither of them had spoken directly about the feelings that seemed to grow stronger each day. She found herself watching for his return when he left camp on hunting trips, felt a warmth in her chest when he sought her company in the evenings, treasured the moments when their hands accidentally touched as he helped her with some task. But she also felt the weight of her situation, the knowledge that she was technically his property, bought and paid for like livestock. The kindness of her treatment didn't change the legal reality of her position, and she wondered sometimes if her growing feelings were real, or simply the natural response of someone who'd been treated with unexpected decency after experiencing betrayal. "What am I to you?" she asked him one evening, the question emerging before she could stop it. "Am I truly your captive or something else?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the fire's dancing light. "You came to me as captive," he said finally, "but captivity is not a permanent condition. It is something that can be changed by choice and time and mutual respect. And what would change it? When you no longer wish to leave, you will no longer be captive," he said simply. The answer was both more and less than she'd hoped for. It suggested that her freedom was in a sense her own to choose, but it also implied that leaving remained an option he would honor. The thought of returning to her former world, to a society that now seemed both alien and artificial, held no appeal. But the thought that she might be staying only because she had nowhere else to go troubled her deeply. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to choose freely," Ayana replied. "A choice made from fear or desperation is not truly a choice at all." The beaded headband felt warm against her forehead as she considered his words, a tangible reminder that she had found acceptance and purpose here that had never existed in her previous life. The crumpled letter that arrived with a traveling trader 3 weeks after Sarah's recovery changed everything she thought she understood about her situation. The paper was stained and wrinkled from its journey, addressed in Thomas's familiar scrawl to whoever might be interested in the whereabouts of Sarah Whitmore. The trader, a grizzled man named Jake, who dealt in everything from Apache ponies to information, handed it to Ayana with obvious reluctance. "Found this posted at the trading post near Tucson," Jake said, his weathered face grim. "Figured you should know what that snake's been saying about your woman." Sarah felt her blood chill as Ayana read the letter silently, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked at her with something that might have been pain or anger, though his voice remained carefully controlled. "Your husband has been telling people that you were taken by Apache raiders," he said quietly. "He claims he tried to rescue you, but was outnumbered. He has made himself a hero, and you a victim in his story." "What does the letter say?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Ayana hesitated, then began to read Thomas's words aloud. "My dear wife was stolen from our wedding bed by savage Apache, who attacked our settlement. I fought valiantly, but was overwhelmed by their numbers. If anyone knows of her whereabouts, I am prepared to pay handsomely for information leading to her recovery, as I cannot rest until she is returned to Christian civilization." The lies came so easily from Thomas's pen that Sarah felt sick listening to them, but worse was yet to come. Jake shifted uncomfortably before speaking again. "There's more you need to know," the trader said. "Been hearing talk around the territory about what really happened that night. Seems your husband got himself in deep with some mighty dangerous folks, men who deal in things besides cards and whiskey." "What kind of things?" Ayana asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Human things," Jake said bluntly. "Women mostly. Young ones they can ship south to Mexico, where questions don't get asked. Word is, Whitmore owed them near $2,000, and they were planning to take his wife as payment when you showed up with a better offer." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't just betrayed her for gambling debts, he'd sold her to save her from an even worse fate. But that meant Ayana had known. He'd deliberately outbid slave traders to purchase her freedom, rather than her captivity. "You knew," she whispered, looking at Ayana with new understanding. "You knew what those men intended to do with me." Ayana's silence was answer enough. The noble Apache warrior who'd treated her with such careful respect, who'd tended her through illness and taught her his people's ways, who'd given her freedom to choose her own path, he'd been her rescuer all along, not her captor. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Would it have mattered?" he replied gently. "Would knowing the full extent of your husband's betrayal have made your situation easier to bear?" You had enough pain to carry without adding that burden. Jake cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's one more thing. Those men Whitmore owed, they ain't the type to forgive a debt just because the collateral got away. They're still looking for ways to collect, and they ain't particular about how they do it. The implications hung heavy in the desert air. Even here, hidden in the Apache stronghold, Sarah wasn't truly safe from the consequences of Thomas's greed and cowardice. The men he'd borrowed from were the kind who viewed human lives as negotiable currency, and they wouldn't consider the debt settled just because their preferred payment had slipped through their fingers. They'll keep looking, Sarah said, the realization settling over her like a shroud. Let them look, Ayanna said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man accustomed to protecting what he valued. They will find only death if they venture into our territory, seeking what belongs to us. The possessive note in his voice sent warmth through Sarah's chest, even as the danger chilled her. She belonged to them now, to this community that had accepted her, to this man who had risked his own safety to save her from a fate she was only now beginning to understand. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words inadequate for the debt she owed him. "There is nothing to thank me for," Ayanna replied. "I did what any man of honor would do when faced with such cruelty." But Sarah knew better. In her world, in the supposedly civilized society she'd come from, how many men would have risked their own lives and resources to save a stranger? How many would have treated their purchase with such respect and dignity? How many would have given her the freedom to choose her own future rather than simply claiming what they'd paid for? The crumpled letter lay between them like a bridge between her old life and her new one, proof of the lies that had defined her past and the truth that was shaping her future. The silver bracelet that Ayanna placed on Sarah's wrist 3 days after the letter's arrival was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Delicate bands of silver were woven together in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the light, and tiny turquoise stones were set at intervals that followed no European design she could recognize. When she asked about its significance, Ayanna's answer left her breathless with possibility and terror in equal measure. "Among my people," he said, his fingers gentle as they fastened the clasp, "such a bracelet is given when a man wishes to declare his intentions toward a woman. It means that his heart has chosen, even if his voice has not yet found the courage to speak the words." Sarah stared at the bracelet, feeling its weight on her wrist like a physical manifestation of the emotions that had been growing between them for weeks. The revelation about Thomas's betrayal and Ayanna's true role as her rescuer had changed everything, stripping away the last barriers between gratitude and something far deeper and more dangerous. "Your intentions?" she whispered, though her heart was beating so loudly she could barely hear her own voice. "To court you properly," Ayanna replied, his dark eyes serious. "To win your affection honestly, without the shadow of obligation or debt between us. To prove that what I feel for you has nothing to do with what I paid for your freedom and everything to do with the woman you have shown yourself to be." The careful formality of his words couldn't disguise the emotion beneath them, and Sarah found herself remembering all the small kindnesses he'd shown her, all the moments when she'd caught him watching her with an expression she hadn't dared to interpret. The cup he'd carved for her comfort, the comb he'd made for her beauty, the patient hours he'd spent teaching her his language and his people's ways, all of it had been courtship, she realized, conducted with a respect and dignity that Thomas had never shown her even during their engagement. "But I'm still married," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Whatever Thomas is, however he's betrayed me, the law still considers me his wife. White man's law," Ayanna said quietly. "But what does your heart consider you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. In the eyes of the legal system that had shaped her upbringing, she was indeed still Thomas Whitmore's property, bound to him by vows that apparently meant nothing to him but everything to the society that had created them. But here, in this hidden canyon where different laws prevailed, where her worth was measured by her contributions rather than her legal status, what did those distant rules matter? "My heart considers me a woman who was sold like livestock by a man who never loved her," Sarah said slowly. "A woman who found kindness and respect among people she'd been taught to fear. A woman who has learned what it means to be valued for herself rather than her usefulness to someone else's ambitions." Ayanna moved closer, close enough that she could see the hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "And what does your heart say about the man who values you?" Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. seeing not the savage of her childhood nightmares, but a man of intelligence and honor who had risked everything to save a stranger, who had shown her patience when she was afraid, kindness when she was sick, and respect when she was vulnerable, a man who had given her freedom when he could have demanded obedience, who had taught her skills that made her useful rather than ornamental, who had never once treated her as anything less than an equal, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. My heart says that such a man deserves honesty in return for all the honesty he has shown me, she replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. It says that what I feel for you frightens me because it is real in a way that nothing in my previous life ever was. It says that I have never been courted by a man who saw me as a person rather than a prize, and that I don't know how to respond to such unprecedented respect. The smile that spread across Ayana's face was like sunrise breaking over the canyon walls, transforming his usually serious expression into something radiant with joy and relief. "Then we will learn together," he said. "There is no shame in not knowing how to do something that has never been done to you before." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, Sarah turning the bracelet on her wrist and marveling at how such a simple piece of jewelry could represent such a profound shift in her understanding of herself and her possibilities. The silver caught the firelight and threw it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own life, and she thought about how different this courtship gift was from Thomas's ivory combs, given with genuine affection rather than calculated charm, meant to honor her rather than obligate her. "There will be challenges," Ayana said eventually, his voice serious again. "My people will need to formally accept you as my intended wife. There are ceremonies, traditions, ways of doing things that cannot be rushed or ignored, and the men who are still looking for me, that danger remains," he acknowledged. "But it is a danger we will face together if you choose to stay, if you choose to accept what I offer." Sarah touched the bracelet again, feeling its warm weight against her skin. "What exactly are you offering?" "A life lived as equals," Ayana said simply. "Partnership instead of ownership. Love given freely rather than demanded as duty, a chance to build something together that honors both our traditions and creates something new." The offer was everything she had never dared to dream of, and everything that terrified her most about stepping completely away from the world she had known. The eagle feather that Grandmother Chenoa pressed into Sarah's hands carried weight far beyond its physical substance. The old woman's eyes were serious as she explained, through Ayana's careful translation, that the feather was a symbol of the choice that lay before her, a choice that would determine not just her own future, but the harmony of the entire community. "The eagle sees all from its place in the sky," Grandmother Chenoa said, her weathered fingers closing Sarah's hands around the feather's shaft. "It chooses where to hunt, where to nest, where to make its life. But once the choice is made, the eagle does not look back with regret. It flies forward with purpose." The tribal council had been called to address Sarah's permanent status among the people. Word of Ayana's courtship gift had spread through the camp, and traditional protocols demanded that the community formally consider whether a white woman could truly become one of them, whether her presence would strengthen or weaken the bonds that held them together in an increasingly hostile world. Sarah had spent the 3 days before the council in careful preparation, learning the proper words and gestures that would accompany her request to remain permanently among the Apache. Grandmother Chenoa and the other women had coached her patiently, helping her understand the deeper meanings behind the ceremonies and the weight of the commitment she was asking to make. "This is not like the marriages of your people," one of the younger women, Singing Bird, had explained. "When you marry among us, you marry not just the man but the people. Your children will be Apache. Your loyalty will be to our ways. Your enemies will be our enemies, and ours will be yours." The implications were sobering. By choosing to stay, by accepting Ayana's courtship and the community's acceptance, Sarah would be closing the door on any possibility of returning to her former life. She would become, in every meaningful sense, Apache, with all the dangers and isolation that such an identity carried in the Arizona Territory of 1874. The council itself would take place that evening around the sacred fire at the center of the camp. The elders would hear her speak, would question her understanding of what she asked, would judge whether her commitment was genuine or merely the desperate choice of someone with nowhere else to go. "What if they refuse me?" Sarah asked Ayana as they walked along the stream in the afternoon before the ceremony. Then I will honor their decision, he replied, though she could hear the pain such an outcome would cause him. The welfare of the people must come before the desires of any individual, even mine. And what if they accept me, but I discover I cannot truly leave my old world behind? Ayana stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Then you will leave, and I will understand that some bridges cannot be built across such different worlds. His willingness to let her go, even now when their feelings had been declared, only made Sarah love him more. Thomas had tried to control her through obligation and social pressure, had made her feel trapped by duty and convention. Ayana offered her freedom to choose, even if that choice might break his heart. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, Sarah found herself thinking about the woman she had been when she first arrived here. That frightened girl in her torn wedding dress seemed like a stranger now, someone who had lived a half-life of careful obedience and empty pleasures. The woman she had become, strong, capable, valued for her contributions rather than her appearance, felt more real than anyone she had ever been before. I need to tell you something, she said to Ayana as they prepared to return to camp for the ceremony. Before I speak to the council, before I make this choice public, you need to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or circumstance. He waited silently for her to continue, his dark eyes patient and encouraging. I love you, Sarah said, the words feeling both foreign and utterly natural on her lips. Not because you saved me, not because you've been kind to me, not because I have nowhere else to go. I love you because you see me as I truly am and value what you see. I love you because you've shown me what partnership means, what respect looks like, what it feels like to be treasured rather than owned. The smile that spread across Ayana's face was radiant with joy and relief. And I love you, he replied, because you chose to see past your fear and find the truth beneath it. Because you learned our ways not to please me, but to find your own place among us. Because you are brave enough to become who you were meant to be. The eagle feather in Sarah's hand seemed to grow warmer as they embraced, as if the great bird's spirit approved of the choice she was about to make. The sacred fire burned brighter than Sarah had ever seen it, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky, as if carrying the words spoken around it directly to the spirits who watched over the Apache people. The entire community had gathered in a circle around the blaze, their faces solemn in the dancing light as they prepared to hear Sarah speak her choice and judge whether it came from a true heart. Elder Standing Bear, the oldest man in the community, rose first to address the assembly. His voice carried the weight of decades as he spoke in formal Apache, his words translated quietly by Ayana for Sarah's understanding. We gather tonight to hear the words of the white woman who asks to walk among us as one of us. This is not a decision to be made lightly, for it affects not just her life and the life of Ayana, who would claim her, but all our lives and the lives of our children yet unborn. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as Standing Bear continued. The woman must speak for herself. She must tell us why she wishes to abandon the ways of her birth people and take on the burdens and joys of ours. She must convince us that her choice comes from wisdom rather than desperation, from love rather than fear. When Standing Bear gestured for her to rise, Sarah stood slowly, feeling the eagle feather in her hand and drawing strength from its symbolic power. She had practiced her words in Apache, wanting to address the people in their own language, despite her imperfect pronunciation and limited vocabulary. Honored elders, respected friends, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. I stand before you tonight, not as the frightened woman who came here many weeks ago, but as someone who has learned what it means to belong to something greater than herself. She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage, aware that every word mattered. In the world I came from, I was valued only for what I could bring to a man's reputation or wealth. I was taught to be decorative, obedient, useful only in the ways that pleased others. I was never asked what I wanted, never encouraged to develop skills that mattered, never treated as if my thoughts or feelings had value. A murmur went through the crowd as Ayana translated her words for those whose English was limited. Sarah saw nods of understanding from some of the women, recognition of struggles that transcended cultural boundaries. Here among you, I have learned what it means to be truly valued, she continued, her voice growing stronger. You have taught me skills that matter for survival and community. You have listened to my ideas, trusted me with important tasks, included me in decisions that affect us all. You have shown me what family really means, what partnership looks like, what love based on respect feels like. Sarah turned slowly, making eye contact with as many faces as she could see in the firelight. I do not ask to join you because I have nowhere else to go. I ask because I have found where I belong. I do not want to stay because I fear the dangers of leaving. I want to stay because I have found purpose and joy and love among you that I never knew existed. She held up the eagle feather, its surface catching the flame's glow. Grandmother Chenoa told me that the eagle chooses where to make its life and then flies forward without looking back. I choose this life, this community, this man who has shown me the meaning of true partnership. I choose to be Apache, not because it is easy, but because it is right. The silence that followed her words stretched long enough for Sarah to begin worrying that she had said something wrong, offended someone, failed to convey the depth of her commitment. Then Grandmother Chenoa rose, her ancient voice carrying surprising strength as she spoke. The woman speaks truth. I have watched her learn our ways, not to please others but to find her own path. I have seen her work beside us, suffer with us, grow strong among us. She is no longer the broken bird who came to us. She has become one of our own in her heart. One by one, other members of the community rose to speak. Some questioned her understanding of the hardships she would face as an Apache woman in a world increasingly hostile to their people. Others asked about her commitment to raising children in Apache traditions, to supporting the community in times of war and privation. Sarah answered each question honestly, acknowledging the challenges while affirming her determination to meet them. When Ayana was asked to speak about his intentions, he stood with quiet dignity and declared his love for her and his belief that their union would strengthen rather than weaken the bonds that held the community together. Finally, Standing Bear called for the decision. The vote was conducted in the traditional way, with each adult member of the community placing a white stone or a black stone in a basket passed among the circle. Sarah watched with her heart pounding as the stones accumulated, unable to tell from their expressions how the vote was going. When the counting was done, Standing Bear smiled for the first time that evening. "The people have spoken," he announced. "Sarah Hartwell, you are welcome among us as a daughter, a sister, a member of our community. Ayana, you have our blessing to pursue your courtship according to our traditions." The Apache wedding stones that Ayana placed in Sarah's palms were smooth river rocks, worn by countless seasons of flowing water until they fit together perfectly, one light and one dark, representing the joining of two different paths into one shared journey. The ceremony that would bind them took place 7 days after the tribal council's acceptance, giving the community time to prepare and Sarah time to learn the sacred words she would speak. Unlike the hurried Christian ceremony that had bound her to Thomas, this Apache wedding was rich with meaning and conducted with reverence that made every moment feel significant. Sarah wore traditional Apache clothing crafted by the women of the community, a soft duskin dress, decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments that caught the morning light. Her hair was braided with eagle feathers and wildflowers, and the silver bracelet Ayana had given her gleamed on her wrist, alongside new copper bands that marked her changing status. Grandmother Chenoa had spent hours teaching Sarah the deeper meanings behind each element of the ceremony. "Marriage among our people is not just the joining of two individuals," the old woman had explained. "It is the weaving together of families, the strengthening of community bonds, the creation of new possibilities for the future." The ceremony took place at dawn when the canyon walls caught the first light and painted everything in shades of gold and rose. Standing Bear spoke the opening words, calling upon the spirits of the 4 directions to witness and bless the union about to be created. Then Ayana and Sarah each spoke their vows, not in the formal English phrases Sarah had memorized from her first wedding, but in Apache words that carried the weight of genuine commitment. "I choose you not because law or family demands it," Sarah said in careful Apache, her pronunciation guided by weeks of practice, "but because my heart has found its home in yours. I promise to walk beside you, not behind you, to share your burdens and your joys, to honor your people as my people, your traditions as my traditions." Ayana's vows in return were simple but profound. "I promise to cherish your strength, not try to diminish it, to value your thoughts, not silence them, to stand with you against whatever dangers may come, and to love you for who you are, not who I might wish you to become." The exchange of the wedding stones was the ceremony's heart. Sarah and Ayanna held the smooth rocks together between their joined hands, while Standing Bear spoke the words that would bind their lives. As these stones were shaped by the same waters, made smooth by the same current, fitted to rest perfectly together, so may your lives be shaped by shared experiences, smoothed by mutual understanding, and fitted to support each other through all the seasons to come. When they released the stones into a small pottery bowl that would rest in their future lodge as a reminder of their commitment, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, as if her heart had finally found its proper rhythm after years of beating to someone else's time. The celebration that followed was unlike anything from Sarah's former world. There was dancing and singing that went on for hours, food shared freely among all present, stories told by the elders about successful marriages and the wisdom gained through partnership. Children ran among the adults with laughter that echoed off the canyon walls, and even the camp dogs seemed infected by the general joy. But what moved Sarah most was the genuine warmth with which the community welcomed her fully into their midst. Women who had been kind but cautious now embraced her as a sister. Men who had watched her with careful evaluation now included her in conversations about the future welfare of the community. Children who had been curious about the strange white woman now climbed into her lap with the easy affection reserved for beloved relatives. As the sun set and the celebration moved into its quieter evening phase, Sarah found herself sitting beside Ayanna, near their own small fire, the wedding stones resting in their bowl nearby. She wore his wedding gift around her neck now, a necklace of silver and turquoise that had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through generations of Apache women who had loved and been loved. "Do you have any regrets?" Ayanna asked quietly, his hand finding hers in the firelight. Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking of the life she had left behind, the world she had rejected. The woman she had been before Thomas's betrayal had forced her to discover who she really was. "I regret that it took betrayal and pain to bring me here," she said finally. "I regret that I spent so many years living a half-life, never knowing what I was missing, but regret this choice, regret you, regret the woman I've become, never." Ayanna lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then we begin our married life without shadows from the past, only light looking toward the future." "Our future," Sarah corrected, and smiled at how right those words felt in her mouth. The new moccasins that Sarah wore on her first morning as a married Apache woman were soft as whispers against her feet, crafted by Singing Bird as a wedding gift and decorated with patterns that told the story of journeys begun and destinations found. Each step she took in them felt purposeful in a way that her delicate Philadelphia slippers never had, designed for walking real paths rather than drawing room carpets. The morning routine of married life among the Apache was both familiar and entirely new. Sarah woke before dawn in the lodge she now shared with Ayanna, a structure they had built together with help from the community in the days before their wedding. The lodge was simple but comfortable, its buffalo hide walls decorated with geometric patterns that held meaning for both their individual histories and their shared future. While Ayanna tended to the horses and checked the snares he'd set for small game, Sarah joined the other women at the stream for the daily gathering of water and washing. But now she was included in conversations that had previously been conducted around her rather than with her, asked for her opinions on matters ranging from the best herbs for treating children's fevers to strategies for preserving meat through the hot summer months ahead. "Marriage suits you," Grandmother Chenoa observed as they worked together to prepare the morning meal. "You move with more confidence now, speak with more authority. This is good. A woman who knows her own worth makes a stronger partner." Sarah smiled as she ground corn for the day's bread, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency that months of learning had developed. "I feel more myself than I ever have," she admitted. "Strange to say, since I'm living so differently from anything I ever imagined. Perhaps," the old woman said thoughtfully, "this is because you are finally living as yourself rather than as what others expected you to be." The observation carried truth that Sarah was still learning to fully understand. In Philadelphia, she had been daughter, then bride, then wife, roles defined by other people's needs and expectations. Here, she was simply Sarah, valued for her own contributions and allowed to develop her own strengths. The morning brought its usual tasks and small challenges. A child had fallen and scraped her knee badly enough to need attention, giving Sarah a chance to practice the healing skills she'd been learning from the medicine women. Two of the young men had disagreed about hunting territories, requiring mediation from the elders that Sarah was now qualified to observe and occasionally contribute to. But underlying the normal rhythms of camp life was a contentment that Sarah had never experienced before. Work felt meaningful when it contributed to the welfare of people she cared about. Decisions mattered when they affected a community she belonged to. Even the simple domestic tasks of maintaining their lodge and preparing meals carried satisfaction because they were chosen rather than imposed. Ayana returned near midday with 2 rabbits and news from the scouts who watched the approaches to their hidden canyon. "No sign of the men who seek you," he reported quietly as they shared their noon meal. "But Standing Bear thinks we should remain cautious. Such men do not forget debts easily." Sarah nodded, though the threat from Thomas's creditors seemed increasingly distant and unreal compared to the immediate reality of her new life. "Are you worried?" she asked. "I am prepared," Ayana replied, the distinction clear in his voice. "There is a difference between worry, which serves no purpose, and readiness, which serves survival." After the meal, Sarah spent time with some of the younger women, teaching them English words while they taught her more complex Apache phrases. The language exchange had become a regular part of her routine, valuable for both practical and cultural reasons. As tensions with white settlers increased, knowledge of English could prove crucial for negotiations or intelligence gathering, while Sarah's growing fluency in Apache deepened her connection to her adopted people. "You speak like one of us now," Yellow Bird, one of the teenagers, told her with obvious approval, not like someone translating thoughts from another language. The compliment pleased Sarah more than any praise for her appearance or accomplishments ever had in her former life. To think in Apache, to dream in Apache, to express her deepest feelings in the language of her chosen people, these were achievements that mattered in ways that playing piano or speaking French never had. As evening approached and the community gathered for the shared meal that ended each day, Sarah found herself reflecting on how completely her definition of a successful day had changed. Instead of measuring success by social calls made or proper appearances maintained, she now measured it by useful work accomplished, relationships strengthened, skills improved, and contributions made to the common good. The new moccasins carried her through her first full day as an Apache wife, with comfort and confidence, each step taking her further along a path she had chosen freely and would walk with pride for whatever days remained to her in this harsh but honest land. The shared lodge that Sarah and Ayana had built together stood as solid proof of what could be accomplished when two people truly worked as partners. 6 months after their wedding, the buffalo hide walls were weathered but strong, the interior organized with the efficiency that came from mutual respect and understanding. Sarah's few remaining possessions from her old life, her mother's Bible, the faded daguerreotype, a silver locket, rested alongside Ayana's medicine pouch and ceremonial items on a shelf that represented the blending of their histories into something new. The winter had been hard but not harsh, the kind of season that tested resolve without breaking spirits. Sarah had proven herself through the difficult months, contributing skills that complemented rather than competed with those of the other women, offering perspectives that enriched rather than challenged the community's traditional wisdom. Her hands bore the calluses and small scars of useful work, her face the weathered look of someone who lived outdoors, her bearing the confidence of a woman who knew her place and valued it. On this particular morning, as spring brought new green to the canyon walls and the promise of easier times ahead, Sarah stood outside their lodge, watching Ayana work with the horses. His movements were as graceful and efficient as ever, but she noticed how he sometimes turned to catch her eye, how his serious face would soften into a smile when their gazes met, how even the mundane tasks of daily life became opportunities for small expressions of affection. "You look thoughtful," Grandmother Chenur observed, approaching with the slow but steady gait that had carried her through more than 70 winters. "Are you reflecting on the journey that brought you here?" Sarah smiled, settling beside the old woman on a flat stone that caught the morning sun. I was thinking about how strange it is that the worst day of my life led to the best life I could have imagined. The spirits work in ways that often surprise us, Chenora agreed. What seems like disaster may be the door opening to destiny. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the activity of the camp as it prepared for another day. Children played games that taught skills they would need as adults. Women worked at tasks that kept the community fed and sheltered. Men discussed plans for hunting and defense with the serious attention that survival demanded. It was a life that required everyone's contribution, where individual welfare and community welfare were inseparably linked. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? Chenora asked. If your first husband had been an honorable man, if you had lived a conventional life among your own people, Sarah considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she admitted, but I think I would have spent my whole life feeling like something was missing, never knowing what it was. I was raised to be ornamental, to live through other people's accomplishments. I would have grown old without ever discovering my own strength or purpose. And now I know who I am, Sarah said simply. I know what I'm capable of, what I value, what kind of life has meaning for me. I know what love feels like when it's based on respect and partnership rather than obligation and ownership. Ayana approached as they talked, settling on the ground near Sarah's feet with the easy intimacy of a man comfortable in his relationship. The scouts report all clear beyond the canyon mouth, he told them, no sign of trouble approaching. The threat from Thomas's creditors had faded over the winter months, though it never disappeared entirely. Such men had long memories and patient hatred, but they also had other concerns and easier targets. Sarah had learned to live with the possibility of danger without letting it dominate her thoughts or limit her choices. I've been thinking, Sarah said to Ayana, about writing a letter to my father, to let him know that I'm alive and well, that I've found happiness he never could have arranged for me. Ayana nodded thoughtfully. And what would you tell him? That his daughter died the night she was sold like livestock? Sarah replied, but a new woman was born from her ashes. That sometimes the greatest kindness is being forced to discover your own strength. As the sun climbed higher and the day's work beckoned, Sarah rose to join the other women in their morning tasks. But first, she paused to look around the canyon that had become her home, at the people who had become her family, at the man who had shown her what genuine partnership looked like. The frightened girl who had arrived here in a torn wedding dress seemed like someone from another lifetime now. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth, who contributed meaningfully to her community, who was loved for who she truly was, rather than what she represented to others. Sarah had found more than refuge in this hidden canyon. She had found herself, and in doing so, had discovered what it truly meant to be free.